I have to believe that no matter how heightened my clients are, that somewhere deep down inside of them, they know they're supposed to share and they're supposed to say please and thank you. Right? And that's what I'm looking to try to tap into, that deeper, more basic, simplistic self, that we can get to the person behind all the bluster. And when we can do that and we can deflate that balloon a bit, then we can get into more productive conversations. Because I genuinely believe when people are misbehaving, and then the pattern's interrupted, and then you sort of kind of gently hold the mirror up, they say, yeah, sorry, I got a little carried away. They might not admit they were wrong. They may mumble it under their breath, which is the best I'm hoping for, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But as long as we broke the pattern, we can make a breakthrough and we can move forward.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're joined by Joe Dillon, a divorce mediation specialist. He helps us define what, and I quote, high conflict communication actually is and why it escalates so quickly. I was really looking forward to this conversation because I've been reading about Joe's work on high conflict communication, particularly in the context of emotionally charged relational dynamics, something we talk about quite frequently on this podcast. A few months ago, I presented a paper on high conflict resolution to a group of lawyers and mediators, which made me especially interested in exploring this topic more deeply. So this conversation feels particularly timely. In this clip of our conversation, we start with a simple example: how something like being late can spiral into much deeper conflict about feeling disrespected or unimportant. We then unpack how people move from discussing facts to defending, and I quote, we put a lot of emphasis on how people defend against painful internal feelings. We explore how the core driver of, again, I quote, high conflict communication is the need to feel seen and heard, and how defensiveness often emerges when someone feels dismissed or like they don't matter. I want to add that I'm aware that conflict occurs for many other reasons, such as the need to stay connected, something I've discussed in the Borderline series. But today the focus was on defensiveness. We cover so much more, including some very practical strategies that we both use to de-escalate conflict and open up communication. Let me get you right into the interview so you can hear how Joe thinks about high conflict communication. Hello, Joe. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm so glad that you're here with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, great. So maybe we could jump right into things with just by setting down a foundation, right? Because you and I are going to be talking about high conflict communication today. And that's been defined, I think, in probably different ways in social media.
Sure.
But I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you typically define high conflict communication, and what sort of core patterns do you typically see?
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm a divorce mediator, so I'm always working on
Yes.
two people at the same time, couples, like yourself.
Mhm.
And when I think of high conflict communication, I think of two people who are attempting to communicate with each other, typically loudly.
Mhm.
And when I say we're talking at each other, talking past each other, and they're unable to see that they're actually in agreement on a lot of things. It's that they're simply not willing to listen to what the
Mm.
other person is saying. And it's a term that I use, I call they're in violent agreement, because they're
Mm.
just in such this spiral of conflict where they're just so escalated and so overheated that they can't actually hear what the other person is replying back. And then as a third party, right, as you're sitting there, you try to break this off and say, listen, folks, you actually want the same thing here. Let's break this
Mm.
down and let me tell you what I hear from each of you, reflect that back to you, and see if that's what you are thinking you're saying or hearing. And most of the times people are like, oh, okay. So once you can break that cycle, I think that's what happens. But for me, in my world, that's the biggest thing. High conflict is when people are talking at each other and they don't realize that they're actually in agreement.
Okay, great. So this is a good place for us to start because so many different things are already coming to my mind about two people talking at one another.
Yeah.
Like, why is that happening, first of all?
Right.
And then what do we do? Like, how do we break that cycle? But before we get into, because that's one of the things we want to cover today, are some of the techniques, the specific techniques that you recommend that are helpful. but I think a good way to keep it grounded, so we're not just talking about theory or techniques, is maybe I could give like a prototypical example, something that you're probably and most of the listeners are familiar with, and I'll keep it broad, just way we could sort of fill it out as we go along in terms of what crosses your mind. Okay.
Sounds good.
So the simple example is, let's say there's a couple and there's a date night, and he comes to date night, he arrives 20 minutes late. Okay. So she is upset when he arrives. And again, here, for anybody listening, you could fill in the blank with any sort of conflict that comes in like this. But here's the main point. She's already upset. So when he comes in, she says, you're 20 minutes late. And this turns very quickly because he feels something, of course.
Right.
Because maybe he worked very hard to get there on time. Like, who knows what sort of emotional state he's walking in with, which is something we could discuss. But it quickly escalates. It turns into, you don't respect me, or you're always late, or you never show up for me. You remember 4 years ago when you didn't show up, or you forgot all what, right?
That's right. Tuesday morning, 11 a.m.
Yeah, you recognize this, right? So what you end up seeing then is we're no longer talking about the relationship or the timing or why or what happened or anything like that.
Right.
That it escalates so quickly into now what we could call, I think, right? I mean, you tell me, like a high conflict communication.
Right.
Because now you have two people talking at one another.
Correct.
Okay. So let's start with that. So maybe a good place to start is, what's your understanding? Because I imagine you probably have some conceptual framework in mind already in terms of what might be, we don't know what's happening, but what might be happening. Like, what drives this kind of reactivity?
Yeah, we see it a lot in divorce. There's a pattern, and you're probably very familiar with it, acknowledgement and validation. In communication patterns, there are a lot of times people just want to be heard. And I know it sounds very simple and very basic. We all, even just think about ourselves as people. Think about your friends, your family. You just want to be seen. You just want to be heard. And in this example, the individual who showed up on time may have gone through, and as a former, New York City resident, has gone through hell or high water to take the train uptown or do whatever they're trying to do to get there on time. And they say, well, geez, stupid me that I rushed through getting ready, got the sitter, ran out the door half hurried, and I got here on time and you couldn't even show up. They don't feel like that effort was acknowledged and it wasn't validated by the other person. Most likely the folks, the individual who showed up late, most likely is defending themselves, right? Well, the traffic was bad. My boss walked into my office at the last minute. The person who ran out the door doesn't care about that. What they care about is that you acknowledge the fact that you're late and they're not. And it can be something as simple as saying, you know what, you're right, I'm sorry. I got hung up, but that's no excuse. In the future, I'll do better. Please tell me how I can make this better. And you're trying to, in a way, as I'm not only a divorce mediator, but a professional negotiator, really, that's what I am. And I think about some of the books that I've read. There's a gentleman, Chris Voss, who was a former FBI hostage negotiator. So he has a great book called Never Split the Difference. And in it, he talks about some of the stories where he's been in hostage negotiations. And he doesn't start off by saying to the person holding the people in the bank, you idiot, that's inconsiderate. Why are you holding them? That's not going to help. He's like, wow, are you okay? What's going on for you? She's trying to show concern. He's taking the temperature of the conversation down. So by acknowledging and validating, it doesn't spiral upwards where defend, yell, yell, yell. It's like, gee, wow, I'm so sorry. You're absolutely right. You see, the temperature goes down in that conversation. And it won't necessarily, you won't clear the decks right away. However, it will at least move the conversation in the right way. So then as you open the menu and you decide what appetizer you're going to get, maybe by the time you get to the main course, things have gotten back on track.
Okay, so let me make sure I just understand it. So the example with the negotiator, in your example, he's actually talking to the person who's holding people hostage, that he'll say, hey, what's going on for you? Something must be happening. What's going on with your day, or something along those lines.
Right. Showing them as a person.
That's very interesting. And talking about a high stakes environment, right? Emotions are escalated, and he's coming in and just saying, let's slow this down. Let me just try to understand what's going on with you.
Right.
And I guess that's one of the things you're saying in terms of validating that you're just slowing things down. You're recognizing that you came late, right? Yep. And that must have been very, I don't know if you go this far, but that must have been very difficult for you. You rushed to get here on time. You did so much. And here I am showing up late. Something along those lines.
Absolutely. That 100%. All people want to know is that you recognize that they did something to make an effort to show up on time in this example, and that there could have been something. And if this is, especially if this is a person on a date or a married couple, there's a really good chance that they're intimately acquainted with each other's days. And by the individual who showed up late, acknowledging that, let's say it's the wife in this example who got there and they have kids and knew she had to get a sitter and get the dog walked and all of those things, knows that and can acknowledge that, then that opens the door for the wife in this example to say, yeah, I know your boss always shows up at your doorstep at 5:30, just as you're trying to walk out. And then it's a shared moment, right? It becomes one of those places where they can acknowledge the almost absurdity of the situation and realize, hey, we're not going to let this ruin our night. And we're here on a date. We've got a sitter. It's important that we make the most of this time. Why should we be miserable? Let's do our very best to turn this thing around. And that's what this type of conversation helps them do.
Right. And in order to do that, you have to open up a little bit of space and try to get them into a mindset where they can actually slow down and begin to think about, even to your point, the rest of the evening, that they still have the rest of the evening. Because
Right.
at that moment, what's happening, you use the word defensive, right? That they're getting defensive. So I guess what they're defending against is what? Feeling dismissed or unimportant or like they don't matter. Like, I guess, what are they trying to express? But they just can't do it in a direct way. So they do it in a way of, I guess, attacking the other person.
Right. The individual, in this case, the gentleman who showed up late, a lot of that defensiveness, it can come from a variety of places. Of course, I'm not a mental health professional like yourself, but
Mm,
I run in those same kinds of circles. And so there's a couple of guesses with this individual is perhaps this individual didn't receive the kind of attention, maybe they were as a child, they were always chided or lectured, or they felt they were never good enough. Your grades aren't good enough. You're not a good enough athlete, things like that.
mhm.
So those patterns from childhood really start to show up. Another thing that can happen is there's folks, and I'm going to admit I'm a little bit of this myself. There's givers, right? I believe when we talk about love languages, mine is service. And when I talk about service, I'm always the person who is doing the laundry, cooking, cleaning, walking the dog, taking care of everything. But then there comes this point where I just kind of melt down because I feel like nobody's walked the dog except me. Nobody's cleaned the dishes except me, even though that might not be a true statement. In this example, perhaps the gentleman who showed up late never got the validation of, wow, I really appreciate all you do for our family and how I know you don't want to work those late nights, but you're doing that to, get that promotion so that we can keep the kids in private school and we can do the ballet lessons and things like that. Having that dialogue between couples can really help diffuse a lot of what we're just talking about here, because you've already built this trust, this goodwill amongst you. And it sounds like with this couple, that might be something that's lacking.
Let me jump in again, because again, I have so many thoughts as I'm just listening to this.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I love to bring in the clinical example, because there's no one right way to conceptualize these things because they're so complicated. But what I actually heard you saying was really interesting, which is, first of all, you take history into consideration. So in other words, that there's a possibility, just to borrow a little bit from my field, a reenactment. We call it like something gets reenacted in the present that
Right.
really was from the past that did not yet get resolved, right?
Right.
But for this thing to get reenacted, you need two participants. And the way you were just talking, you were focusing on him, the guy who showed up late, almost as if, and I don't know if this was a slip or just the way you heard my example, or if there's some unconscious meaning here, which would be interesting, but that he needs to be validated as well.
Yeah.
See, because I was imagining she was the one who was upset and he needs to come into the situation because he was running late and validate and acknowledge
Yep.
that he kept her waiting.
Yep.
But what you're saying is no, it's a little bit more complicated because he's going to have his own history, his own set of feelings, his own sensitivities, and he too will need some sort of validation. Did I hear it correctly? Is that the way you think about it?
Yeah, in that example, I always think of the person, in this case, we're just using the gentleman who showed up late, makes that first move, right? Somebody has to go first in any conversation. In this example, what I've seen patterns, time and time again, and these are folks that, for example, I'm talking with about property and selling houses and alimony. These are really hot button issues. And for one person, so I'll use an example from my world, which is alimony. Well, one person is starting to get on the other one about it. Like, so the gentleman, most of the time, it's not always men who pay, but in this example, I'll just use a man paying a woman. And then he's going at her about, you need to get a job and we can't spend all this and blah, 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 and she spits back immediately like, do you think I have an MBA. Do you think I wanted to give up my job on Wall Street? No. We talked about having kids and we decided I'd stay home. So that's why I need alimony. And so when she snaps, that's usually when I see the other person go, you know what? You're right. And so now he made that first step in this example, just like in our date night. If he makes that first acknowledgement and validation, wow, you're right. the chances are good that there's going to be one that comes back. And I see this all the time. Like, she goes, I know. She's like, I've been happy to raise the kids. It's been wonderful. You're a great father. You're a great provider, but I just need some help to get on my feet. And then that's when we have, a breakthrough, right? That's kind of just a general term, not a clinical term, but we have a breakthrough. We go, hey, you two, good work here today, right? Okay, now we're on the same page. Now we can talk about how much alimony is going to be, for example, in my world. So you see, it's kind of somebody's got to go first. I usually think of it as the person who's more the aggressor first. That's typically going to result in a validation coming back their way, which is exactly what we're looking for. Both of them have now turned the dial down on the volume of their conversation, if you will. So
somebody has to go first. Whew. Okay, so last week I presented at a conference to a group of mediators and lawyers and judges. I don't know if you're familiar. It's the Tennessee Mediator Association. I think that was the name of the organization.
Sure, yeah.
The presentation was on high conflict couples, right? Like really dealing with high conflict situations. So just that idea that somebody has to go first. I imagine, Joe, you sitting there in the room, but defenses are hard. They're hard to break down. They become ossified, especially, right. I don't know if you think about it in these terms. I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but when you're dealing with people, another word for high conflict in my field is personality disorders.
Okay.
So when you have somebody who has a personality disorder, the defense is the main structure that holds them together.
Right.
So when they're defending, it's like they become ossified, they become stuck. So having one person go first, it's not like you could talk to them in a reasonable way because they're not in that state of mind at that moment and say, hey, let's be reasonable. Maybe you can look at his perspective that whatever it is, that he just rushed to get here and took the subway and he's running late because they need to defend themselves by all means. So I'm just curious if we get a little closer to your example, and you may not see this because these may not be your clientele. But do you ever get those cases where they're stuck and somebody's not willing to go first because to say, hey, you're right, or to validate, to go back to one of the techniques that you mentioned, that's central, means you have to give up a certain amount of, and I hear this from my own patients, power, control, as if you're as if that's not control, by the way. See, that takes a great deal of power and control to be able to say, I'm sorry, or you're right, or this is my responsibility. But I'm just curious if you have cases like that where they become so recalcitrant that nobody's willing to take that first step.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there.
Yes, we do. And again, another book that comes to mind is sort of the treatise on modern negotiation called Getting to Yes. It's a book by Fisher and Rye, and it's more of a practitioner's book, but I recommend it to anyone who's even remotely interested in negotiation. And in there, they have a technique that they refer to as look for the position behind the position. And at first you're like, you tilt your head and you're like, I'm sorry, what does that mean? And in this example, that's exactly the technique I would use. A lot of times when people are in conflict, they're very positional. They're very just one-dimensional. Yes, no, you're bad, you're good, you're bad. And in order to get anywhere, we need to break that pattern. Sometimes, so what I'm looking for is the position behind the position, meaning what is making this person say, rah, 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 going after it? Or even and this seems like a bit of a parlor trick, and it kind of is, but it's meant when we think of little kids, right? When again, not a child psychologist, want to be real clear about that, but kids have a meltdown, right? Sometimes over the craziest thing, right? Somebody just starts bawling for no reason. You're like, what is happening? One of the things that's very helpful is you're not going to yell at them, stop crying. That's not going to help. it's to disrupt the pattern, right? We all try to get the toy and go, look, it's Mr. Bear, And what are we doing? We're interrupting that cycle in the brain. So in my world with dealing with adults, I wish I had a teddy bear, but I don't in session. But what I'm doing is I'm looking for the position behind the position, and I'm asking a question that is completely unrelated to the conflict that we've got today. I'm interrupting the cycle. And it might be something as simple as like, wow, hey, Bob, sounds like you had a tough day, even though I have no idea if he did or he didn't, but just the way he's presenting himself to Sue in my example is just seems unusual, because in my world, I can always bank on, at least always, I think, because these people are getting a divorce, that means they got married. And at some point, they professed their undying love for each other in front of friends or family or justice of the peace down at City Hall, whatever they did. So I know at some point, these two individuals had a loving and caring relationship. It's gotten lost for whatever reason, but to be able to go around this conflict and get behind this individual and say, what's going on for you? Because I'm thinking to myself, I'm going, you don't strike me as the kind of guy who's a hothead. You strike me as a level-headed guy. So what's going on? And then I distract that. Yeah, today I had this third quarter meeting, even though it has nothing to do with divorce, right? Oh shit, what happened? Oh yeah, my boss got on me about the reports. I'm like, oh man, that stinks. That's that acknowledgement validated. It's like, hey, you want to take a break? It sounds like you could use 5. You want to get a coffee? And then just redirect.
I really appreciate this technique. And I know you used a teddy bear, right? Like as a metaphor.
Yeah.
But it's interesting the way that I heard it, because I didn't see you as like distracting. I saw you like you got to it eventually. You said that's actually the validating, you see, because you were validating. Again, in my field, we call this containment, but part of containment is not just absorbing all the negative energy, and you're not a punching bag. You're not just taking everything in, but you're very much present. You're connected, and you're asking inquisitive questions to understand sort of what's behind, like you were just getting at. So when you said, wait, did you have a bad day at work or something along those lines? That's like a containing sort of statement, because you're trying to understand him a little bit better. I think I appreciate what you're saying, that you are distracting him. At the moment, you're not staying focused on what I would call the smoke screen, the anger, all of that is like the smoke screen. And we need to understand and let him know, more importantly, not just that we need to understand it, but that he needs to feel like we can see and we recognize and we appreciate something that's going on inside of him, which in this example is the bad day, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that works almost every time. And because again, that person, just for some reason, I truly believe now, again, clinically, I'm certain there are exceptions to this rule, but I truly believe, at least I was, you were, we were raised by parents who did the very best they could. We were taught, whether it was from our parents or our neighbors or our school teachers, some modicum of respect, manners, how to operate in polite society. So I have to believe that no matter how heightened my clients are, that somewhere deep down inside of them, they know they're supposed to share and they're supposed to say please and thank you. Right? And that's what I'm looking to try to tap into, that deeper, more basic, simplistic self, that we can get to the person behind all the bluster. And when we can do that and we can deflate that balloon a bit, then we can get into more productive conversations. Because I genuinely believe when people are misbehaving and then the pattern's interrupted, and then you sort of kind of gently hold the mirror up, they say, yeah, sorry, I got a little carried away. They might not admit they were wrong. They may mumble it under their breath, which is the best I'm hoping for. And I'm okay with that. Yeah. But as long as we broke the pattern, we can make a breakthrough and we can move forward.
Yeah, so this goes nicely into another technique of yours, because I wanted to review a few of your techniques that seem really important in your work. And it's so interesting because last week at that conference, I actually said something that's very similar, I think, to one of your techniques. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about this one. And you're so close to it. So I'm just making a little bit of a leap, which is help me understand.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one of your techniques. Right. And I imagine it's very close to this, because it's almost like when you say to him, oh, you must have had a bad day at work. Right. Although that's a little more closed. Sure. Help me understand is a little more open-ended, but they're so similar. Yeah. I really appreciate it, because so often in these high conflict cases or communication, I hear why. Like, why did you do that? Why did you show up late? Why don't you listen to me? And what I try to do is help patients begin to what we call mentalize, like understand, how is that going to come across? Can you imagine how that would come across? And they get it. Like that why is more like an interrogation. Yeah. And it will put somebody on a defense, right? And escalate things, as you know. But I'm curious to hear more about your technique about, can you help me understand? Like, how do you see that? Maybe you could describe it in terms of how it unfolds. As you can see, once conflict escalates, it's rarely about the surface issue. It's about something much deeper trying to find expression. And if we can begin to recognize that shift in real time, it opens up a very different way of responding. In the next clip from our conversation with Joe, we'll take this a step further and get into additional techniques, like using, and I quote, help me understand, or let me say, can you help me understand that a bit better? Or I really like to understand what you mean when you say, and then we'll talk about that. And that's a way to reduce defensiveness. So we'll look at that technique in more detail and what he calls, and again, I quote, detached engagement. In my field, something known as self-other differentiation. But don't worry, we'll get into that in more detail in the next clip and how those two techniques are really helpful when you're dealing with high conflict communication. Okay, everyone, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.